In 1845, the British Royal Navy sent two discovery vessels, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, complete with a crew of 129 men under the command of Sir John Franklin, into the Canadian Arctic in search of a northwest passage through to the Pacific Ocean. Not a single one of these 129 men survived. Instead, those who came after, sailors and overland explorers searching for Franklin's lost expedition, scoured the rocky shores of the Arctic archipelago and found a strange and scattered assortment of what came to be called relics, prosaic objects that spoke to the gruesome magnitude of the Franklin disaster and transformed their original owners into secular saints of an Arctic crusade. Spoons, buttons, scraps of clothing, torn papers, unpaired boots, and golden watch chains, all scattered across the barren ground of King William Island, hundreds of miles from the nearest source of rescue. By entering the Arctic labyrinth, Franklin's men had sailed into a trap, exposing themselves to the elements, the freezing temperatures, the unbreaking hold of the pack ice, and the meager resources of the unforgiving land that could support no more human life than the small population of Inuit who already inhabited the region. Amongst these abandoned holy objects of daily life left behind by Franklin's crew lay the crewmen themselves, bleached bones and torn clothes intermixed with their possessions, nothing more. Though Franklin's crew, and especially his officers, must have recorded their experiences in logbooks and journals, none of these detailed records remain. To date, searchers have recovered only two official records, each consisting of the same naval form letter, pre-printed onto fragile individual sheets and filled in by hand by Franklin's officers. Only one of these, a single page known as the Victory Point Note or Victory Point Record, contains vital but scant details of what horrors the expedition faced, confirming the death of the expedition's commander, Sir John Franklin, and the abandonment of both ships, which were trapped in the pack ice. Written around the edge of the form letter read these last fateful details. HM ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd April, 5 leagues north-northwest of this, having been beset since 12th September 1846. The officers and crews, consisting of 105 souls under the command of Captain F.R.M. Crozier, landed here. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847, and the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. As blunt as its phrasing is, this single sheet, discovered in the late 1850s, became a perfectly serviceable final nail in the coffin for Franklin's lost expedition. The Victory Point record was reproduced on the cover of the Illustrated London News in 1859, and from an official perspective, the book could thus be closed on Franklin and his men. One private, fragmentary written record from the expedition, however, also survived, and it can give us a glimpse into the lived experiences of Franklin's men in a way the Victory Point record could never do. The so-called Peglar Papers, composed by experienced but working-class sailor Henry Peglar, captain of the foretop on HMS Terror, consist of a bundle of texts found cradled under the skeletal frame of one of Franklin's unfortunate men. The man who found the grisly discovery, Sir Francis Leopold McClintock, described the remains in sympathetic detail in his best-selling first account of his voyage, published very shortly after his return to England in 1859. Shortly after midnight of the 25th May, when slowly walking along a gravel ridge near the beach, which the winds kept partially bare of snow, I came upon a human skeleton, partly exposed, with here and there a few fragments of clothing appearing through the snow. The skeleton, now perfectly bleached, was lying upon its face, the limbs and smaller bones either dissevered or gnawed away by small animals. A pocketbook afforded strong grounds for hope that some information might be subsequently obtained respecting the unfortunate owner and the calamitous march of the lost crews, but at the time it was frozen hard. This victim was a young man, slightly built, and perhaps above the common height. The dress appeared to be that of a steward or officer's servant, the loose bow knot in which his neck handkerchief was tied not being used by seamen or officers. The pocketbook that had given McClintock strong grounds for hope, however, did not yield the sought-for answers. McClintock noticed that it fell to pieces when thawed and dried, and though it contained 9 or 10 letters, a few leaves were apparently blank, and so the pocketbook receded within the popular consciousness, behind the clearer evidence of the Victory Point record. In the second edition of his narrative, published a decade later, McClintock added some greater detail, identifying the papers as having been written by Henry Peglar and outlining their contents as best he could in the appendices, cataloging the assortments of poems, postal addresses, and other fragmentary jottings. Yet, McClintock still saw the pocketbook as a disappointment, saying, "Only a few detached sentences have been made out, and these do not in the slightest degree refer to the proceedings of the lost expedition." Amidst the disheartening realization that Peglar's papers would not provide an easy narrative of what exactly had happened to Franklin's expedition, McClintock assumed that the skeletal remains were likely those of Peglar himself. In this analysis, however, McClintock appeared to have forgotten that the body was found wearing a neck handkerchief tied in the distinctive loose bow knot of a steward, not a garment or style likely to have been worn by a captain of the foretop, like Peglar. Because the man found holding this bundle of documents seems to have been a different man than Peglar, many scholars of the Franklin disaster have, since the 1950s, attempted to solve the mystery of the relationship between these two men. During the mid-20th century, Syriacs and Jones suggested Thomas Armitage, gunroom steward of HMS Terror, an identification followed by David C. Woodman in his incorporation of evidence from Inuit testimony into a fuller picture of the Franklin story. More recently, Glenn Stein has proposed that the remains were those of William Gibson, subordinate officer steward of HMS Terror. On one of the sheets of paper preserved in the pocketbook, Peglar inscribed the details of the ships on which he served, allowing scholars to demonstrate that he did serve with both Armitage and Gibson on the HMS Gannet, and again with Gibson on the HMS Wanderer. In the process of creating this text, Peglar crafted the story in the shape of a rectangular spiral looping toward the center of the page, where the words "Now in the Terror" remain legible to this day. In form, almost all of Peglar's papers are incredibly idiosyncratic, mainly composed in backward writing, and often also in creative shapes. They were heavily damaged by the elements and initially believed to have been written in German. David C. Woodman referred to Peglar's musings as lower-deck doggerel and some incomplete and incomprehensible fragments. Because of the lacunose state of preservation, the papers have taken on some of the cultural character of Sapphic fragments, and therefore lend themselves to the same type of reception analysis to which classical scholars subject some of Sappho's more fragmentary poems, which remain evocative evidence of Sappho's poetic and cultural context, despite their state of textual decay. Rather than trying to plumb the Peglar papers for precise geographical or chronological details of the Franklin disaster, certain scholars and literary interlocutors have instead begun to engage with the papers on their own poetic level, seeking a personal connection to history, adapting and interpreting the text upon each new reading. Since the turn of the 21st century, interest in Franklin's lost expedition has been on the rise, and popular investment in the story skyrocketed after the discoveries of the wrecks of both Erebus and Terror in the mid-2010s. This has led to an outpouring of fictional and creative nonfiction reimaginings of the Franklin disaster. Because of the scarcity of written evidence from the expedition itself, many of these modern receptions have focused upon the elite individuals leading the expedition, while the working-class victims of the disaster are more often relegated to the sidelines. Henry Peglar, however, has proved one of the notable exceptions. Though not yet the protagonist of his own story, Peglar's papers have enabled him to claim a place in numerous Franklin fictions. Certain modern scholars have interpreted the Peglar papers as containing erotic content, most often interpreted in academic contexts as heterosexual on account of the appearance of a Victorian anatomical slang term, the open sea, within the adapted text of a lyric poem, Barry Cornwall's The Sea, which Peglar copied out in some of his clearest script, free of code or creative calligraphy, though full of his own invented verses, distinct from any published version of the poem. The erotic reading of Peglar's poem seems to have arisen at the end of the 20th century with David C. Woodman, and has since become the sole interpretation within scholarly prose treatments of the Franklin disaster. Edward Parkinson suggests, with credit to Woodman, that the double entendre symbolizes a desire many sailors would have had for both the open sea and unrestricted sexuality, particularly when contrasted with their difficult, dangerous, and restricted lives on board a typical 19th century vessel. Though the connection between maritime freedom and sexual desire has remained a part of the Peglar Papers' legacy, the firm heterosexuality assigned to Peglar by scholars in this period has loosened somewhat, in parallel with increased understanding of 19th century gender expressions and sexualities. There are forensic grounds for this broadening as well. DNA testing of remains from Franklin's expedition show evidence of individuals with European ancestry lacking a Y chromosome. Though likely to be the result of DNA degradation over time, this could point toward the presence of sailors on the Franklin expedition who had been assigned female at birth, living their lives as naval men. It is only in combination with imaginative world-building, however, that a true queer genealogy for Henry Peglar has developed. Modern fiction and creative non-fiction works have incorporated the Peglar Papers' fanciful turns of phrase into a gay and inherently tragic love story between two crewmen of the expedition. Working closely within the historiographical and archaeological traditions, Leanne Shapton's Artifacts of a Doomed Expedition, as a work of journalistic nonfiction, pairs Peglar with Thomas Armitage. Theories about the papers vary, Shapton carefully observes. Paranoid notes from a brain addled by lead poisoning, evidence of division among the ranks, notes being written between the crew in code. The handwriting is sophisticated and tidy. The papers include backward phrases like, "Whose is this coffee?" and "O death, where is thy sting?" I wonder if one line, "All my art, Tom," meant Peglar and Armitage were in love. Traditionally, when ships wintered over in the Arctic, the crews would put on concerts and pantomimes to offset the boredom. Illiterate sailors were taught to read. Parlor games were played. I wonder if Armitage was carrying souvenirs of a winter night spent below decks killing time. Peglar: "I'll wager I can write that song backward." Armitage: "My arse you can." Peglar, winking: "Backward and in a circle, mate." On formalistic grounds, this isn't surprising. The fragmentary nature of the Peglar Papers places them within a specific tradition of reading queerness into the fraying margins of poetic texts. AIDS activist Paul Monette, in his memoir, wrote that a gay man seeks his history in mythic fragments, random as blocks of stone in the ruins covered in Greek characters, gradually being erased by the summer rain. We have the poems of Sappho, because the one rolled linen copy stoppered a wine jug in a cave. Fragments are all you get. This queer promise of fragments can be carried into the theoretical apparatus of Halberstam's queer archive as a variant of the archive of feelings, which is a model particularly useful for engaging with traumatic histories of loss, such as the Franklin disaster. Although more typically used in the context of purely queer historical archives, like the lives lost to the AIDS epidemic, the queer archive as a collection of historical and personal narratives that preserves a queer experience centered around loss, grief, and information decay may explain how Peglar's papers came to be seen as queer texts, at least within their metafictional afterlives. Because of the processes of destruction and loss, the objects themselves, the relics, must be used to reconstruct the individual, producing an intertextual and intertemporal queer dialogue. This work of creating a fictive queer Peglar began in 2007, with the publication of Dan Simmons' novel The Terror, a supernatural horror treatment of the Franklin expedition. The novel's structure of rotating point-of-view characters enables the reader to see into the experiences of secondary characters. Through this lens, the audience learns of Peglar's relationship with one John Bridgens, a subordinate officer's steward on HMS Erebus. Eschewing the more traditional scholarly identifications of the skeletal guardian with Thomas Armitage or William Gibson, the novel instead creates new contrasts and ahistorical details. John Bridgens, on the other ship, Erebus to Peglar's Terror, is depicted as Peglar's contrasting number. An older man, whereas the historical Bridgens was 26, the novel purposefully swaps the digits, making him 62, who taught this younger Peglar to write and to appreciate not just literature but also sciences and natural history. During their shared, albeit fictive, participation in Charles Darwin's famous 1831 voyage of the HMS Beagle. Bridgens, upon his narrative introduction in the novel, is also shown as explicitly queer, a man who liked men when ashore, but who never bragged of it nor brought his inclinations to sea, with a distinction drawn between ethically correct liaisons on land and predatory behavior on board ships. Simmons' narration is clear. Bridgens was no pederast. Because of this conflation between place, land versus sea, and age, relationships between adults on shore versus pederasty with young boys on ships, only a past romantic relationship exists between this Peglar and this Bridgens. They are former lovers who interact through the pure discourse of knowledge in the present. In this way, Symonds plays into 19th century presumptions, presenting the misguided cultural stereotype that all gay men preyed on boys, a predominant fear in the Navy at the time, and opposing these harmful stereotypes only by taking all suggestion of a queer sexual interaction out of the naval context altogether. Though this narrative insistence upon chasteness invokes troublesome tropes of the inherent corrupting effects of gay sexuality, the friendship between the two men is nevertheless tied into a grander queer context. The code of the Peglar Papers becomes a shared language, which Bridgens calls Peglar's childlike idea of Leonardo's backward writing encryption. Paralleling the archaeological evidence described by McClintock, albeit swapping McClintock's young man for an old one, Bridgens becomes, in death, the guardian of the papers. After Peglar's own death, Bridgens elects to walk out alone into the barren wilderness and die with his friend's papers held protectively under his own body, after reading to himself the familiar refrain, "O death, where is thy sting?" conducting his own small funeral for himself by reciting this line out of the standard seaman's burial service from the New Testament. When Symonds' novel was adapted into a 10-episode miniseries for television about a decade later, the relationship between Henry Peglar and John Bridgens remained a core subplot, though the texts through which the two men communicate their feelings differ. Throughout the 2018 miniseries The Terror, these two characters reference shared reading material, and during their first on-screen interaction, Peglar refers to Bridgens as the lending library, showing the centrality of literary texts and the textual tradition to both men within the universe of the miniseries. From Jonathan Swift to Herodotus, from Voltaire to Xenophon, Peglar and Bridgens exchange these authors' names as they might exchange kisses or flirtations within a setting less hostile to queer relationships than a 19th century naval expedition. Herodotus, and in particular Xenophon, as Greek authors, invoke the trope of Greek love or Platonic love, which is visually applied to Peglar and Bridgens as characters in the show, two men who engage in chaste yet subtly romantic intimacy through a student-teacher framework. Yet the spectral presence of a more explicit sexual relationship haunts the show's intertext. By exaggerating the oppositions between the two men, through casting choices that highlight the fictive, reversed age gap between Peglar and the older Bridgens, through the distinction between a London accent for Peglar and a northern accent for Bridgens, through an artificial height difference enabling Bridgens to stand a head taller than his younger lover, the miniseries invokes and simultaneously critiques the Greek conceptions of pederastic love. The show mediates and meditates on these sexual undertones by shifting the depiction of the death of Peglar and the subsequent death of Bridgens. Instead of leaning into the obvious line, "O death, where is thy sting?" read by Bridgens to himself, they make use of a different poetic resonance entirely. A scene in the 9th episode shows the aftermath of Peglar's death. Bridgens grieves, silently reading Peglar's journal, while Peglar's non-diegetic voice recites aloud his own version of the Barry Cornwall poem, The Sea.
The sea, the open sea. It grew so fresh, the ever free, the ever free, the ever free. Without it, guard it will run to the earth above the regions round. I love the sea. I love the sea.
This last line, "I love the sea, I love the sea," is purely Peglar's invention, appearing nowhere in the original song, but clearly visible in the paper's text. When recited aloud, the emphasis placed on "I love the sea" as the last reading, Peglar's last words, becomes as a stand-in for I love you," invoking the old idea that a sailor is married to the sea as a parallel for how Peglar loves Bridgens as a romantic partner. And, in a final moment of perfect slippage between archaeological artifact, text, and metatext, a small sketch of an eye from the Peglar Papers becomes a tattoo on Bridgens' arm, providing a fictive etiology for the real image, and reinscribing the relationship between Peglar's words and Bridgens' body. Not only does this new choice of poetic quotation link Bridgen's unwillingness to live after the death of one he so loved with the discourse of Peglar sexuality, but it also highlights a complex historical intertext between Barry Cornwall's poem, Peglar's adaptation, and, to jump back 2,000 years, Xenophon's The March of the 10,000, or the Anabasis. The first line of Cornwall's lyrics and Peglar's is the sea, which in the 19th century was a famous line of schoolboy Greek. Thalassa, thalassa, shouted in triumph by Xenophon and his fellow Greek soldiers after a deadly overland march. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the Anabasis became a popular teaching text for ancient Greek, and this refrain, thalassa, thalassa, found its way into the common language of Victorian exploratory heroics, part of an imperial cultural context routinely invoked by the terror through the shared literary games of Bridgens and Peglar. In an earlier episode, the show's Bridgens had used the Anabasis to warn Peglar of the grueling march that was then to come. Here, at the end of their journey together, the echo of the sea, pulls together the concepts of Greek love, 19th century education, desire for sexual freedom and expression, and the queer archaeology of loss and fragmentation, as this Bridgens carries his lover's papers to their final resting place, out of life and into legend, preserving with his body this only private record of the Franklin disaster. Through the processes of the Peglar Papers' evocative fragmentation, reimaginings of the Franklin expedition have learned to treat the text metonymically as a lover. The man found with the Peglar Papers has become, through fiction, part of an ancient tradition, the natural human desire to be buried in one grave with one's beloved. In this way, the small world of a single Arctic disaster opens up a broader queer universe, which offers hope despite tragedy, love in the midst of death. The title of this paper, Saints Who Never Existed, derives from a poem by W.H. Auden, part of his Marginalia. Animal femurs, ascribed to saints who never existed, are still more holy than portraits of conquerors who unfortunately did. Because of the Franklin expedition's recent resurgence in the popular consciousness, we have increasingly received portraits of conquerors in the form of the Franklin expedition's leaders, proponents, and beneficiaries, many of which depictions offer nuanced, critical, even decolonizing perspectives of the harm done by British imperialism in the name of polar discovery. Too often overlooked, however, are the working-class victims of the Franklin expedition, men who joined a dangerous voyage to the north and never came home. Henry Peglar, both the real British sailor who participated in an imperial project that killed him, and simultaneously the fictive creation made to represent the love possible even past the end of all hope, a saint, we might say, who never existed quite as we now imagine him, might just be able to teach us how to tell these new stories.